Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, welcome back to the program, and today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of conflicts that are taking place around the globe, and in some cases could be a conflict coming to an area near you. Now, first, what has brought me out today? Well, I had the opportunity to listen to some commentary by some content providers. Specifically, I had the opportunity to listen to this guy, Ruben F. Johnson. Ruben F. Johnson. Very interesting character if you look at his background and try to understand where he is coming from in terms of his analytical opinions. Very interesting. So let's quickly jump into his background. Ruben Johnson is director of the Asia Research Center and Korea Fellow at the Kashmir Polanski Foundation. He has over 30 years' experience analyzing and reporting on foreign weapon systems and defense technology and the international politics of arms exports. During this time, he worked for several years in the U.S. defense industry as a foreign technology analyst and later as a consultant for the U.S. Department of Defense, the Navy, and Air Force departments, as well as for the UK and Australian governments. He currently writes regularly for several professional defense and aerospace technology publications. Over the years, he has reported for the Washington Times, the Bulwark, the Weekly Standard, the Washington Free Beacon, National Review Online, CNN, Aviation Week, Breaking Defense, blah, 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 blah. Since 1988, he has reported from most of the world's major aerospace and defense expositions, as well as from landmark events such as the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, the 2008 Sichuan earthquake in the People's Republic of China, the 2004, 2005, and 2013 through 14 Ukrainian revolutions, and the 2022 Russian invasion and occupation. He holds a BA from DePaul University and an MA from Miami University, Ohio, in the U.S. with both specialization in Soviet Russian studies. He is based in Warsaw, Poland. He has won back-to-back awards for defense reporting in 2022 and 2023. All right, so what is this guy saying? Well, essentially, he is a massive proponent for continued NATO expansion. Now, as we know, there are conversations ongoing between the United States, the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces about a possible peace resolution, ending the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, one major element to any peace negotiation for ceasing this conflict, for the Russians in particular, would be that the Ukraine cannot join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They can't do it. Not allowed. Is that a reasonable request to end the conflict? I would say it is. Again, the reason we are where we are at in terms of this war is because of NATO expansion. Again, collapse of the Soviet Union, the unification of West and East Germany, the pullout of all Soviet forces from Eastern Europe, the massive Soviet tank armies were pulled out of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. Soviet forces eventually removed themselves from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And what did NATO do? Well, instead of hitting the pause button and understanding that essentially they had won the Cold War, the Soviet Union was no longer preparing or showing a capability to launch military operations against Western Europe. Not only that, the Soviets, the Russians, were pulling out of these locations. The infrastructure that was in place to launch military operations against Western Europe were being removed. No longer there. And not only that, the Soviet Union had collapsed. So you have the removal of these massive Russian/Soviet forces in terms of hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of tanks being pulled out of Poland and Eastern Europe. And what did NATO do? And again, instead of rationally hitting the pause button, they began rapid expansion. They moved into Poland. They absorbed Poland into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They absorbed Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. They absorbed Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic. NATO moved into these places where there were once thousands of Soviet troops. So again, you have this eastward deployment of Western neoliberal combat forces towards the Russian Federation. Look, if the Russians had really wanted to, they could have simply stayed in Poland. They could have done that. The Russians could have stayed in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They could have done that. The Russians could have stayed in the Ukraine. They could have done that, but they didn't. They pulled back. The Russians even pulled out of what is now Belarus. Now, if I was a Russian strategic planner, if I was on the Russian general staff, and seeing what we are seeing now, in hindsight, I imagine they're kicking themselves and saying, "Boy, we made a strategic blunder," and they did. Because I don't even think on the surface they were expecting the sort of aggressive NATO expansion that took place post-collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the problem that I have with this NATO expansion, it was done under the guise of a threat, a non-existing threat by the Russian Federation towards Eastern and Western Europe. They were still, the powers that be in NATO, were still propagating this Russian threat towards Western Europe. Hey, the Russians could move back in. The Russians could deploy forces and retake Poland. Hey, the Russians could move into the Baltic states. They probably could. The Russians have the capability to do that. Taking Poland, especially now, very, very difficult situation for the Russians, even now. And then finally, the nail in the coffin for the Russians was the eventual expansion into NATO. And this is where this guy comes in, this Ruben F. Johnson. This guy still believes that NATO should expand into the Ukraine. And not only that, he often refers of even post-Ukrainian expansion, right? Meaning after the Ukraine is absorbed into NATO, what's next? What comes next? Is it southern areas? Do targets for NATO expansion fall into the realm of Georgia, maybe Azerbaijan, Armenia. I mean, who knows? Look, if NATO can expand into the Ukraine, and again, if we go back into history, right? If we go back into the mid 80s, and you existed during the Cold War, if I were to tell you that we would be looking at, in the not too distant future, NATO moving into the Ukraine, a NATO headquarters in Kiev. If I would have told you that in 1985, you would have said, voice of reason, you are insane. That will never happen. The World War III would occur before the Ukraine, before Kiev becomes the eastern headquarters of North Atlantic Treaty Organization operations. Right? Because remember, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is designed to protect Western Europe from quote-unquote Soviet Russian aggression. We are no longer even in the realm of considering a Russian invasion of Western Germany. Hamburg, Dusseldorf, Frankfurt, Stuttgart is not going to be overrun by Russian tanks. That isn't even in the equation right now. Not even in the thought process. And that's why it existed. And that threat from Russia to overrun Western Germany no longer exists. And not just Western Germany, Eastern Germany, Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden. All of Germany is no longer threatened by Soviet/Russian troops. Not only that, we don't have a Russian capability, a Soviet capability in Eastern Europe. Those Soviet tank armies are gone. They cease to exist. So again, what is the purpose now of NATO? Well, it's an eastward expansion, and eventually, if you go into post-NATO absorption of Ukraine, you then have to ask, what is next? You have to ask this guy, hey, what's next? What do you think is next there, Ruben? Where do you want to go next? Well, Ruben, I'm sure if you were at a cocktail party with Mr. Ruben F. Johnson, he would then tell you that, again, get a few martinis under his belt. At that point, he would tell you the breakup of the Russian Federation. We have to end the Russian Federation. It is too big, it is too large, it is too threatening, but ultimately you have to have an enemy. You have to have an enemy to advance the military-industrial complex. Now go back to Dwight Eisenhower's statement about the military-industrial complex. It is insidious, very profitable. I can tell you that much. But that's where we are. And that's why now you hear commentary by Ruben F. Johnson. That is the goal. Now, on CNN, will you hear that goal be articulated as the eventual breakup of the Russian Federation? No, they won't say that. But that is the goal. That is the goal post-absorption of the Ukraine. And the Russians know this. The Russians are not a stupid people. They play a lot of chess. They understand what is coming for them. And that is why we are seeing what we are seeing now. Now, additionally, outside the scope of the current conflict that is taking place, we are also seeing a buildup of U.S. forces positioning themselves for possible military operations against Venezuela. Now, the question is this: will we see large numbers of U.S. troops entering Venezuela? And the short answer to that is no. What will probably happen is there may be some sort of air operation or air campaign that takes place against the current government in Venezuela. We could see a U.S. intelligence agency-backed coup d'etat or some sort of internal operation take place in Venezuela. Right now, it does appear that the U.S. is positioning itself to have the capability to launch an air campaign against Venezuela. Now, again, beyond that, we're not really seeing the positioning of the required forces that it would take for a ground military occupation of Venezuela. That would be costly. I don't believe that is in the best interest of the United States, and I don't believe the current U.S. government believes it is in the best interest of the United States. Is it in the interest of the United States to have the Maduro government removed from Venezuela? Probably. Probably. Is it reasonable to assume that is going to happen? Difficult to say. A lot of moving pieces right now, a lot of money that could be flowing either way that could eventually remove Maduro from power. Now, would it take some nudging? Would it take the threat of kinetic violence, military force, to nudge him out of that hemisphere, out of Venezuela? Possibly. Possibly. We'll have to see what happens. But again, in terms of YouTube content, we see a lot of discussion about the prospects of a U.S. military invasion of Venezuela. Again, we don't think that is going to happen right now. We don't think that's going to happen. Could military activity take place? Yes, but not invasion-level military activity. Not at this point. Not at this point. But again, we are continuing to cover and watch events that are taking place in the Ukraine. Obviously, the Russian Federation and the leadership of the Russian Federation is adamant about certain military objectives being achieved. And right now, I don't believe the Russians have achieved enough of those military objectives to make peace worthwhile. To make peace worthwhile. Now, at the same time, again, if we go back and we look at this man and we look at especially this, the amount of military hardware, equipment, and treasure that has been handed over to the Ukrainians is astronomical. I don't think, and I wanted to jump into this before I ended today's piece of content. I don't think the average American, the average dumbed down, uninformed urbanite, really understands how much of their tax dollars have gone to supporting this war effort in the Ukraine. By March 2024, the majority of Western governments had pledged more than $380 billion of aid to Ukraine since the invasion, including nearly $118 billion in direct military aid. So if you look at the defense budget of, say, the United Kingdom or France or even the Russian Federation, the average defense budget is going to run between $40 and $80 billion. Okay? These Western governments, including the United States, have handed the Ukrainians what is essentially the entire pre-war Russian defense budget to the Ukrainians. And it may be much, much higher than that. Much higher. At this point, we don't really know how much military aid has been handed over. There's also been a lot of aid in terms of military resources and capability that have been given to the Ukrainians and that is operating in the Ukraine right now that is classified. Do you really believe for a minute that a few Patriot missile batteries is the cause of the shoot down of large amounts of Russian cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and in some cases hypersonic missiles, and thousands upon thousands of drones being fired into the Ukraine? You really believe that mobile Ukrainian militia units, territorial defense units, running around with AK-74s are shooting down Russian attack drones in the middle of the night? Do you believe that? Well, it's happening. And I can tell you, it's definitely not the use of Ukrainian territorial defense militiamen running around at 2 o'clock in the morning shooting down Russian attack drones and cruise missiles. That is not the reason those systems are being brought down. It's a lot more advanced than that. And right now, China, North Korea, and obviously the Russians are paying very close attention to systems that are being used in this conflict. Western systems that are being used to interdict Russian missile systems. Are they getting them all? No, they're not. A lot of Russian systems are getting through. And it is a perpetual game of who can shoot down systems and who can deliver explosive packages against their adversary. And that's what is happening. But again, if we look at this, if we just go down this, starts here with Albania, and we can see just Argentina, just a massive amount of military equipment. This is Australia. Australia right now has given 56 M113 AS4s, 120 Bushmaster protected mobility vehicles. It's given 49 M1A1 main battle tanks. Did you guys know that Australia handed over what is essentially its entire tank fleet to the Ukrainians? Did you know that? Now, obviously, the Australians purchased new systems, but again, in some cases, we've seen what is essentially the entire military stockpile that was being used by some nation states handed over to the Ukrainians. Look at this. Azerbaijan, Austria. And we'll just keep going down here. Belgium. Look at this. Several AM-120s for, several, huh? Right. That's gonna pass muster for an audit. Oh, we gave them several. Right. We don't even know how much military supplies were handed over. I can just imagine some warehouse, some reserved warehouse in the United States that was just stockpiled, ready for World War III or World War IV. And some DOD and CIA guy comes in and basically every single piece of equipment in that warehouse was taken, loaded on a truck, put on a C-17, and then flew to the Ukraine or Western Europe to be transported to the Ukraine, or C-130. Cambodia. Look at this. What country is this? It's kind of strange how you got to go all the way out here to Canada. Just the amazing amount of equipment that training more than 33,000 Ukrainian troops as part of Operation Unifier. Canada, did you know there was 33,000 Ukrainian troops have been put through Canadian training? Did you know that? Yeah. Well, it's happening. Or has happened. Croatia, I think, basically, again, handed over its entire stockpile of military arms to the Ukraine. I mean, look at this. I mean, Croatia is not a big nation state, okay? It's just not. And it essentially handed over 14 Mi-8 helicopters, 30 M84 main battle tanks, 30 BVP M80s, those are armored infantry fighting vehicles, 15 130mm M46s, 40 Delta 30 howitzers, 35,000 Zastava M70 assault rifle. That right there would have essentially equipped the entire Croatian military. The whole thing. 5,000 FN-FAL battle rifles, machine guns and ammunition, tens of millions of small arms ammo, thousands of grenades, procurement for 155mm ammunition through the European Defense Agency to be delivered. Even Cyprus has handed over some stuff. But it is incredible, astronomical how much. Look at this. This was, who is this? This is the Czech Republic. So again, the entirety of probably the Czech stockpile of operational T-72s. This is interesting. So this was a joint venture by Germany and the Czech Republic of 38 T-72 Mike 1s, 12 T-72 Mike 1s, and 24 T-72 Mike 1. So these were the stockpiles of T-72s that existed in the Czech Republic post-Soviet collapse, and were probably in some cases being used by the Czech army. Again, all of those systems handed over to the Ukraine. It is mind-blowing how much military equipment has been given to the Ukrainians. What country is this? Denmark. Yeah, Denmark went into their entire stockpile and handed over 40 out of 80 Leopard 1 A5s, a couple of Leopard 2s. They purchased and or created and upgraded these 15 T-72 Avengers. $80 BMP-2. So what they essentially did is they purchased these things from the Czech Republic, refurbished them, and then sent them to the Ukraine. An unspecified number of CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles. And we haven't even got to major powers. This is just Denmark. Little old Denmark. Look at this. I mean, you could reasonably equip multiple armies with the amount of equipment that has been handed over to the Ukrainians. I mean, it is just unbelievable. And it's not really talked about. You don't hear it on the news. I mean, obviously you hear, continued Western European assistance to the Ukraine. But when you hear that, you don't oftentimes fully understand what is taking place. And then you hear about the war, and you hear about challenges by the Russian military in terms of its military operations in the Ukraine. And you think and you believe that, well, this little Eastern European country called the Ukraine is handing Russia a bloody nose. It's much more complicated than that. It is so much more complicated than that. And the effort in terms of the amount of assistance and the amount of money that is being slung around in this conflict, at some point in the future, there's going to be an audit and there's going to be an understanding of just how much assistance was given. And again, it's just not really being talked about right now. I think we're looking at France right now. Look at this. They don't even tell you the amount. This is for the French. ammunition, 1.1 million ammunitions of various calibers, 13,000 OF-37 high explosive hand grenades, 1.7 million small arms ammunition, 46,500 rounds of 155 millimeter artillery, 10,000 rounds of 105 millimeter artillery, 6,200 elements. Again, this is just France. 100,000 combat rations from France. Well, I could tell you what, having consumed a French MRE, those Ukrainians are eating good, because they're probably the best MREs on the planet, in my opinion. $103. Oh, I think we skipped. I think this is Germany now. Yeah, this is the Germans. Germans handed over just in tanks 103 Leopard 1A5s, 269 mine-resistant ambush protective vehicles, 140 infantry fighting vehicles of the Martyr, 78 tracked all-terrain vehicles, 18 Leopard 2s, 54 M113s, a lot of air defense. I mean, they don't even tell you. They say, yeah, we sent them some Sea Sparrows. Yeah, we sent them some Sea Sparrows. How many? We really don't know. It was like a warehouse over here, and yeah, we pulled up some trucks. We loaded the trucks, and we sent them over. We couldn't tell you how many it is. I mean, wow. Yeah, anyway, I think you get my point. So feel free to check this out. You just go into Wikipedia and look at Ukrainian military assistance country by country, and you'll see it. So that is where we're going to end today. As always, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.